They're going to build 35 houses on your land whether you like it or not. That's what Victoria Sterling, the president of the Ho, declared while tearing up my property deeds in front of rolling news cameras. Backed by a team of lawyers, the city council, and what seemed like bottomless funding, she steamrolled anyone in her path. And I was just one man, trying to protect the lakefront home my family had cherished for generations. For months, I watched helplessly as her luxury development took shape on land that legally belonged to me. The town celebrated her as a visionary. Meanwhile, she portrayed me as a stubborn loner standing in the way of so-called progress. Victoria was convinced she'd already won, but she overlooked one critical question. What happens when you pick a fight over the wrong lake? My name is Jake Morrison. I lived peacefully at my grandfather's lake house on Morrison Lake for 15 years. He built it himself in 1956 after returning from the Korean War, and it had stayed in our family ever since. Each morning began with the sound of water lapping against the dock. I'd make a pot of coffee and start my remote programming work, surrounded by a view that never lost its beauty. The pine trees Grandpa had planted decades earlier were reflected perfectly in the water. This place wasn't just Seneca, it was soul deep home. I could have lived anywhere, but I chose to stay right here. This house wasn't just shelter, it was a living connection to the man who raised me and taught me everything that mattered. My college roommate, Connor Blake, still came by every few months. He worked a high-speed marketing job in Denver, but the lake was his escape. He always showed up with camera gear and ideas about going viral. "You're sitting on gold, man," he'd joke, gesturing toward the shoreline. Wasted content potential, but he got it. He understood why I stayed, while others saw me as a recluse. Connor respected the depth of what this place meant. That's what kept us close after all these years. Then everything changed. Victoria Sterling swept into town with a project she called Lake Paradise Estates. Dressed like real estate royalty, she promised growth that nobody had asked for. She claimed that most of my land fell within a community development zone, despite nearly 70 years of unbroken family ownership. Suddenly, her surveyors and legal team were trespassing onto my property, drawing boundaries, acting like I didn't belong. It was beyond bold, it was hostile, but boldness was her trademark. Victoria moved through life like someone who had never been told no, and she clearly didn't plan to start with me. Our first meeting made one thing brutally clear. This wasn't just business to her. "Your grandfather stole this lake from my family in 1985, she said coldly. "My father spent the rest of his life trying to win it back. He lost everything. Today, I'm taking it back." I had a faint memory of the legal battle she referred to as something about water access rights, but Grandpa had won it fair and square with ironclad records and proper legal channels. Victoria, however, never let go. She had turned that defeat into a decades-long obsession, learning every inch of property law until she found the cracks. Now she had the wealth, the power, and the influence to bend the law until it broke. The bulldozers arrived early one morning without notice. From my kitchen window, I watched them destroy my grandfather's memorial garden. They tore up the stone bench where he used to sit with the morning paper, where he mourned the friends he lost in the war. It was the very first thing they crushed on Victoria's orders. She stood nearby in a flawless suit, orchestrating the chaos like a maestro conducting a demolition symphony. I rushed outside, clutching the original property deeds assigned, notarized, and fully legal. She took them from my hands and ripped them in two. "Paper means nothing now," she said with a sneer. "Progress doesn't wait for nostalgia, Mr. Morrison." Within days, concrete foundations had replaced generations of family land. Security cameras now faced directly into my windows. Armed guards walked the borders like it was a military compound. I was a prisoner in my own home. Then came the certified letter. It gave me 48 hours to surrender all rights to the Lakea or face a $2 million lawsuit. Enough to destroy me financially, enough to take everything I had. That's when I realized this wasn't just about land. Victoria wanted to erase us entirely. That evening, I sat on the dock in silence. An old brass key in my hand is something I discovered tucked inside my grandfather's desk. Heavy, intricately carved, its markings were completely unfamiliar. "What do you think this opens?" I murmured to Connor, who turned it over under the porch light. inspecting every detail. We scoured the house, looking for a lock that matched. Nothing. Outside, Victoria's crews kept pouring concrete under harsh floodlights, erasing my history hour by hour. I clung to that key like it was the last link to a man who could no longer guide me. And for the first time, I wondered, had Grandpa left behind more than just memories? I want to know, what do you think that brass key opens? Drop your wildest guess. I'll pin the best theory. Determined to fight back, I hired the most expensive attorney in the county, Benjamin Walsh. He was confident from the moment we met, flipping through my documents with the ease of a man who'd handled dozens of cases just like mine. "This is an open and shut case," he said, spreading the deeds across his polished desk. "No hoe has the legal authority to seize private property for a development project, not even with political pull or deep pockets." He promised swift action, a legal injunction to bring the construction to a screeching halt. For the first time since the chaos began, I felt something close to hope. Maybe the law still worked. Maybe, just maybe, the system would protect those who had done everything right, paid their taxes, and held clear ownership for decades. When we walked into the courtroom, I expected a routine hearing. Instead, it was packed with Victoria's supporters of families who had already bought villas, local business owners thrilled by rising property values, and Ho board members eager to see her vision fulfilled. Their legal team presented their case with a level of polish and precision that made my attorney look like an amateur by comparison. They crafted a narrative where I was the lone obstacle to progress, portraying me as a selfish recluse standing in the way of community growth, while positioning Victoria as a trailblazer, bringing prosperity and modern housing to a region desperate for it. Families took the stand one after another, sharing heartfelt stories about their dreams of lakefront living. They spoke of excited children picking out new rooms, and of life savings poured into Victoria's promises. The emotion in the room was palpable. Judge Harrison listened to both sides with what looked like interest, but I could see it in his eyes. His mind was made up before my lawyer ever wrapped up his opening arguments. The verdict hit like a wrecking ball. Not only was our emergency motion to halt construction denied, I was ordered to pay $75,000 in legal fees, punished for what the court called a frivolous attempt to obstruct a legitimate community development. Judge Harrison's reasoning cut deep. "Mr. Morrison, while private property rights are undeniably important, the need to house 35 families clearly outweighs one man's desire to preserve undeveloped land." Ben Walsh, the attorney I'd put my faith in, dropped the case that same day with a phone call so short it barely qualified as a conversation. "Jake, there's no winning against this," he said flatly. "They've got connections at every level, illegal, political, financial, and the public narrative's already stacked against you." I'm withdrawing. Just like that, I was alone. No allies, no legal defense, nothing but a shrinking patch of land and fading memories. Victoria didn't waste a second celebrating. That evening, she hosted a champagne reception right there on my own property. News crews circled while local officials praised her leadership and vision. She stood tall, delivering a victory speech from the exact spot where Grandpa's garden had once bloomed. "Today, progress has triumphed over selfishness," she announced to loud applause. "Mr. Morrison, you have 24 hours to vacate. This land belongs to the people now, and the people have spoken." News coverage painted me as a bitter old loner who finally lost his delusional fight. Meanwhile, Victoria basked in the glow of media praise, celebrated as a defender of housing rights and a heroine of economic growth. I watched the crowd from my window, strangers cheering while standing on the ground where Grandpa had been laid to rest. That night, I sat by the lake with a bottle of Grandpa's old whiskey in my hand, taking swigs as floodlights illuminated the construction site. Cement trucks poured foundations non-stop, as if to rub salt in the wound, like they wanted to make sure I saw every inch of my family's land being buried in concrete. Connor found me around 2 a.m., still sitting by the shore. That's when I broke. I failed him, I told him, my voice shaking with a mix of grief and fury. I let them destroy everything he spent his life building. He gave me something meant to last, and I let them take it. Maybe it was time to give up, sell what was left, vanish somewhere they'd never find me. The defeat wasn't just legal, it was personal, deep. like I had betrayed the man who gave everything for me. In a haze of alcohol and hopelessness, I threw the brass key into the lake, watched it arc through the air and splash into the shallow water near the spot where Grandpa used to skip stones with me when I was a kid. But the second it hit the water, a knot formed in my chest. That key wasn't just a trinket, it was the last physical link to Grandpa, the man who raised me after my parents passed. I stumbled into the cold lake, determined to retrieve it. When I pulled it from the water and held it in the moonlight, I noticed something I hadn't before: real complex engravings, delicate patterns etched into the brass. Not random scratches, but intentional markings, carved by someone who knew what they were doing, someone with a serious engineering mind. That's when I remembered what Grandpa said in the hospital, the last thing he told me before he slipped away. At the time, I'd chalked it up to delirium, the confused mutterings of a man on morphine. If they ever come for the lake, he'd said, remember, water always finds its way home. Back then, I thought he was being poetic, talking about the rain, the water cycle. But now, those words rang in my ears like a warning or a message. I spent the rest of the night tearing through his study with frantic determination, digging through drawers, pulling books from shelves, hunting for anything that might explain what he meant. And then I found it, hidden behind a row of dusty photo albums, the snapshots from Korea, family summers at the lake. I discovered a small wall safe I'd somehow never seen in all my years living there. It was old, but sturdy. The brass key fit perfectly into the lock. Inside was a hand-drawn schematic, a blueprint that made my heart race the moment I unrolled it. Morrison Dam A Emergency Lake Control System A for family use only. The diagram laid out the inner workings of a dam system built deep in the woods behind our house. Detailed notes described water flow calculations, pressure control mechanisms, and what looked like a private reservoir access grid, so intricate and ahead of its time. It was hard to believe it had been built in 1956. But the dates were clear. The dam had been built the same year as the house. Grandpa had constructed both, side by side, one to house his family, and the other to guard the water they depended on. Only now did I realize, he had left behind more than just memories. It had taken 67 years for someone to uncover the real reason Grandpa built the dam. As I studied the blueprints under lamplight, something inside me shifted. The helplessness that had consumed me was replaced with something colder, sharper strategy. Victoria wanted her 35 luxury homes beside the lake. Let's see how she feels about 35 homes beneath it. I'd just discovered I could control the lake itself. What would you do with that kind of power? Let me know. How would you get revenge? Connor showed up early the next morning to find me hunched over the blueprints, surrounded by notes and coffee-stained maps. I looked up at him, blurry-eyed and wired, like I hadn't slept in days. You look like you've either seen a ghost, he said, setting down breakfast, or solved every mystery in your life at once. I didn't speak, just handed him the drawings. He studied the pages slowly, and I watched his expression shift from concern to confusion to stunned disbelief. Holy shit, he whispered, running a finger across the diagram. Your grandpa built a dam? A private dam? How is that even allowed? And how has nobody ever found this? I explained what I'd pieced together. Back in 1956, before water management responsibilities shifted to local authorities, private landowners could legally obtain state permits to construct water control systems. Grandpa had taken full advantage of that brief legal window. We followed his hand-drawn map deep into the overgrown woods behind the house. The path, though faint and tangled with time, still held a subtle wear of footfalls made decades earlier, Grandpa's secret trail to his hidden legacy. Eventually, we reached a rocky outcrop that, to the untrained eye, looked completely natural. But carved into the stone were the words, Morrison Dam A 1956, a private property. And there it was, a brass control panel, nestled into the rock face, with mechanisms that mirrored the engravings on Grandpa's key perfectly. Your grandfather was a damn genius, Connor said, running his hands over the machinery. This is more solid than half the infrastructure built today. It's flawless. The dam blended so well into the stone that no surveyor or drone scan had ever flagged it. That explained how Victoria's entire development had overlooked it during months of planning. Inside a sealed metal compartment beneath the panel, we found something even more valuable than the damned self, a grandpa's engineering journal. Each page documented the construction, function, and purpose of the system. One entry from 1957 jumped out. Built this as insuranceia for the day someone tries to steal what belongs to the Morrison family. Another, dated just 3 weeks before he passed, chilled me to my core. Pray Jake never has to use this nuclear option, but if he does, he'll remember, water always finds its way home. Connor and I exchanged a long, silent look. Somehow, Grandpa had predicted all of this. He built this dam not as a vanity project, but as a safeguard, a final line of defense against people exactly like Victoria Sterling. We launched a full-scale recon mission using Connor's professional drone gear to map the construction layout, every villa, every support beam, every foundation recorded with GPS accuracy. And what we found made my pulse race. All 35 of Victoria's villas had been built at the lowest elevation around the lake, carefully positioned to maximize water views. But there was just one problem. They sat only 4 feet above the current waterline. Connor opened a surveying app, fed in the elevation data, and turned to me, stunned. "Jake, raise the water by 3 feet, and everything floods," he said, showing me the numbers. The design's flawless. They didn't account for this because no one ever imagined someone could actually control the lake. Victoria's obsession with luxury views had created her greatest vulnerability. She'd put profit above common sense. And now, the lake she wanted to conquer could turn on her in an instant. But with that power came a moral storm. I couldn't sleep that night. The ethics twisted in my chest. Was I really prepared to destroy millions in property? To devastate families who, however unwittingly, had invested in this disaster? Connor and I went in circles for hours, arguing, pacing, drinking cold coffee. But again and again, we landed on the same hard truth. Victoria had taken everything through legal trickery. She desecrated my grandfather's grave, torn up my family's legacy in front of cameras like it meant nothing, and all of Ida for revenge over a decades-old grudge. They bulldozed his memorial, Connor said during one of our more heated debates. They're literally building mansions over your grandfather's grave. And she admitted this whole thing was about vengeance, not community, not housing. That was the moment I stopped wrestling with it. The programmer who once cherished peace and solitude was gone. In his place stood someone different, someone willing to fight with the only weapon left, the water. The plan was clear, precise, ruthless. Victoria's grand unveiling was set for the next morning, a full-blown media event with champagne, ribbon cuttings, and local officials eager to endorse her vision. It would be the perfect moment. The time had come for the lake to reclaim what was taken from it. With the world watching, Connor took charge of documenting everything. He set up an array of high-end cameras, multiple angles, lenses, and mix. "This isn't just revenge," he said, testing battery packs. "This is environmental justice. People need to see what happens when families are robbed of their land by greed disguised as progress." I stood over the dam controls one final time, running calculations like a man planning a surgical strike, not reckless destruction, but precise correction. I wasn't here to harm anyone, just to make sure that Victoria Sterling's empire didn't stand on the bones of my family. From my vantage point, I could see Villa 35 getting its final touches under the hum of floodlights. Crews moved like ants, unaware that the ground beneath them had a ticking clock. Tomorrow, Victoria would toast her complete Victoria, confident she had erased the Morrison name from the shoreline forever. But she didn't know about the forecast, and she certainly didn't know about the emergency control system waiting, quietly, for this exact moment since 1956. Connor adjusted his cameras. I checked the dam's gauges and flow settings. Every detail had to be exact. A controlled, slow release over 6 hours, raising the water by 3 feet. No danger to human life, yet just a total erasure of her ambition. "You sure you want to go through with this?" Connor asked, connecting his live stream. I didn't answer immediately. I thought about Grandpa's garden, bulldozed into nothing, about the decades of stewardship my family had given this land, about that brass key silent for 67 years and now in my hand. I nodded. At 3 a.m., we moved into position, cloaked in darkness and damp air. Connor carried his gear like a war photographer preparing for the front line. I held Grandpa's key, the same one I'd once considered throwing away, now poised to rewrite the fate of everything Victoria had built. The forest around us was quiet, eerily still except for the subtle sound of water flowing through channels my grandfather had carved with his own hands, channels that had waited over half a century to be used for their true purpose. Slow and steady, I said under my breath, 3 feet in 6 hours, no harm, just justice. Connor launched the live stream, angles locked on both the dam and the downstream construction zone. He gave the feed a title, When a Lake Fights Back. Living environmental justice unfolds. Then I turned the key. The mechanisms groaned to life here, but not with hesitation, with strength. Grandpa had built them to last, and they moved with the quiet efficiency of something far ahead of its time. As I watched valves rotate and pressure gauges adjust, I realized the full genius of what he'd created. Water surged into long hidden channels, gentle at first, barely noticeable to anyone beyond the dam. But I knew this was the beginning of the end. Morrison Lake was returning to its original shoreline, the one Victoria's team had ignored in their rush for profit. Connor narrated the unfolding event with calm authority. Viewers, you're witnessing the lake reclaim its history, a stolen ecosystem correcting itself. The stream caught fire, gaining traction online, shared across social platforms as a kind of resistance in motion. By 4 a.m., the first subtle consequences reached the construction sites. Workers arriving for early shifts stepped onto unusually soggy ground. Puddles had formed where bare soil had been dry just hours earlier. A few raised eyebrows, some muttered questions, but no real alarm yet. Connor whispered into his mic, Phase 1. They don't even realize they're standing on the lake's memory. The stream's chat exploded. People from around the world watched the story unfold in real time, gripped by the spectacle of nature quietly asserting itself. By 6 a.m., the water had crept to villa doorsteps. What began as confusion quickly spiraled into panic. Construction crews who had never seen a site flood overnight began frantically calling supervisors, inspecting equipment now half submerged in several inches of water. Tools were rushed to higher ground. Workers scrambled to move materials. Foremen barked orders into radios, trying to reach Victoria's engineering team, but there was nothing anyone could do because that higher ground they searched for, it was vanishing with every passing minute. Victoria had built her dream homes too close to a sleeping giant, and now that giant was awake, it was time for the lake to take back what was rightfully hers. With the world watching, Connor stepped into the role of documentarian, setting up cameras with meticulous care. He called it environmental justice, live and unfiltered. The world needs to see this, he said, checking his gear. People have to understand what happens when corporations try to seize what generations have protected. I reviewed the dam's controls one final time, calculating the precise volume and flow rate to submerge the construction zones without risking lives. Standing at the control panel with Grandpa's brass key in hand, I looked out across the lake. Down below, Villa 35 was nearly finished. Work lights cast long shadows across the site as crews worked late into the night, completely unaware that the ground beneath them was about to rise. Tomorrow, Victoria Sterling would throw her victory party, fully convinced she'd erased the Morrison legacy. She had no idea that tomorrow's weather had plans of its own, and she definitely didn't know about the hidden control system that had been sleeping in the hills behind our house for 67 years. Waiting for this very day. Connor aligned his cameras. I reviewed the flooding sequence again. Every setting had to be perfect. You sure we're doing this? He asked, testing his live stream connection. I didn't answer right away. I thought about Grandpa's gardenia flattened, about 70 years of family memory, replaced with imported Thailand poured concrete, about the brass key that had waited, untouched, for generations. I took a breath. We were ready. At 3 a.m., beneath a blanket of darkness, Connor and I returned to the dam with everything we needed to capture what would become the most satisfying act of rebellion in my life, and maybe the most symbolic act of environmental defense in state history. The woods around us were deathly still. The only sound was the faint trickle of water moving through channels Grandpa had etched into the land long before I was born. Channels built for this purpose, to protect the lake when no one else could. Slow and steady, I reminded, turning the brass key in my hand. We raised the water by 3 feet, over 6 hours. No one gets hurt, but everything she built goes under. Connor activated the stream, locking in wide and close-up shots of the dam's mechanisms and the construction sites below. Broadcasting live, he said, adjusting his mic. Let's see what happens when a lake fights back. I turned the key. The ancient machinery groaned on see a broken bar, then began moving with perfect grace. Grandpa had built it to survive storms, decay, and time itself, and it did. Every gear turned as if he'd only installed it last week. Water surged into channels I hadn't even seen on our earlier visit, a clever diversions carved into the earth, now funneling liquid vengeance toward the villas that had stolen the shoreline. At first, it was almost imperceptible. The water moved with the hush of a whispered secret, but I knew we'd just crossed the point of no return. By sunrise, Lake Paradise Estates would be exactly that, a paradise for fish. Meanwhile, Connor's livestream was gaining steam. Viewers from across time zones were tuning in, night owls, early risers, and overseas spectators, all caught in the pull of a headline writing itself in real time. At 4 a.m., the first signs of trouble reached the construction sites. Crews arriving for early shifts stepped into wet ground that had been bone dry the night before. Puddles shimmered under work lights, forming in strange places just enough to raise eyebrows, not alarms. Connor narrated it like a news anchor. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, the lake is coming home. This is nature correcting an old injustice. The stream exploded in popularity. Comments poured in, screenshots were shared, hashtags trended. People weren't just watching it, they were choosing sides. The workers still assumed it was a minor drainage issue, something their well-paid engineers would sort out in an hour. But they didn't know what we knew. They didn't know this wasn't a malfunction. This was Morrison Lake remembering who it belonged to. By 6 a.m., the water had reached the thresholds of several villas. Panic hit fast. Construction crews arriving for their regular shifts found their expensive tools standing in 6 inches of water, a water that hadn't existed the night before. Confused shouts echoed across the site. Foremen barked into phones. Engineers were called out of bed. Workers rushed to move materials and machinery to higher ground, still believing there was higher ground, but the truth was hardening, inch by inch. There would be no higher ground by noon. Connor zoomed in on the chaos, capturing the exact moment when the realization hit. The workers understood this wasn't a leaky pipe or a freak storm. This was something far bigger. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in construction equipment, he narrated to a rapidly growing online audience, now doubling as deep-sea artifacts in Morrison Lake's homecoming event. Site managers ran in frantic circles, helpless as their multi-million-dollar project drowned at scrambling after their hill had been washed away. And that wasn't far from the ecological truth of it. By 7 a.m., the water had reached the windows of the ground floors. That's when Victoria received the call that would destroy the most important day of her life, the culmination of a 40-year obsession unraveling in a single morning. Connor's livestream had exploded, now pulling over 50,000 live viewers. Social media was on fire, with people tuning in from all over the world to watch the mysterious, unexplainable flood that no one had seen coming except us. The site looked like a scene from a disaster movie. Workers evacuated in waves, splashing through rising water, leaving tools and materials behind to be swallowed by the encroaching lake. What had been a work site hours earlier was now a rapidly expanding artificial lagoon. At precisely 8 a.m., Victoria arrived in her signature white suit, dressed for triumph. Instead, she was met with an impassable road, submerged beneath nearly 2 feet of water. She abandoned her luxury car and waded through knee-deep lake water in $3,000 designer heels, definitely not made for wading through flood zones. By 9 a.m., the lake had stabilized at a level I had carefully calculated using Grandpa's notes. Only the rooftops of the villas remained visibly, 35 identical shapes now reduced to floating markers of a failed empire. From above, the view was poetic, symmetrical rooftops poking through the water, like tombstones marking the grave of Victoria's real estate dream. Her stolen kingdom, now reduced to scattered islands in a lake that had reclaimed its natural shape. Connor's viewership doubled to over 100,000. News helicopters arrived overhead, scrambling to cover what they were calling the most baffling flood event in recent state history. No one had an explanation. Emergency services were paralyzed. Rescue boats couldn't navigate between the debris and submerged construction. There was no safe way in. More than $8 million in equipment and materials were now underwater, most of it likely beyond recovery by the time any salvage plan could be organized. And then, through the rising water, came Victoria. She slogged through the flooded site like a furious ghost, soaked from head to toe, hair plastered to her head, suit ruined, shoes lost to the lakebed. She climbed onto my porch, trembling with rage, her whole body shaking, and not just from cold, but from a lifetime of fury finally turning inward. "You psychotic lunatic," she spat, pointing at me with a mud-streaked hand. "You've ruined everything. My career, my life's work. 35 families have no homes because of you. I'm calling the FBI. You're going to prison for this. This is terrorism." I sat calmly on Grandpa's old rocking chair, coffee in hand, steam rising into the cool morning air. Behind her, the sun rose over Morrison Lake, a clean, clear, still, my family's lake. "Good morning, Victoria," I said evenly, taking a slow sip. "Beautiful day for a swim, don't you think?" "I didn't destroy anything," I continued. "I just reminded the lake where it's always belonged long before you tried to steal it." Connor kept the camera rolling, documenting every moment of her breakdown. His audience had passed 200,000, flooding the chat with comments, gifs, memes, and reactions. "Ladies and gentlemen," Connor announced with a grin, "Lake Paradise Estates has officially transformed into, well, a lake, just as nature intended. A poetic correction to a corporate mistake." Victoria stood waist-deep in water, her once flawless suit smeared with muck and frustration, her revenge campaign quite literally underwater. Still, she couldn't let it go. "You have no idea what you've just done," she snapped. "I will crush you. I have lies you don't even know exist. You are going to rot in prison for this." I smiled, raising my coffee mug in a quiet toast to Grandpa's memory and the legacy he built. "You might want to learn how to swim first," I said, "but don't worry. I hear prison has excellent swim classes." Connor turned his camera to capture her face as the weight of her defeat settled in. She had nothing left to say, only water to wade through, and a broken empire sinking beneath her. "What do you think Victoria's next move will be?" Connor asked his audience with a wink. "Wrong answers only. Let's see how creative you can get." Victoria, now waist-deep in a crisis of her own making, scrambled to seize control of the narrative. By noon, she had organized a hastily arranged press conference at City Hall, transforming herself from waterlogged antagonist into a crusader for justice with jaw-dropping speed. Despite looking like she'd washed ashore from a shipwreck, she stood before a packed room of reporters with unwavering conviction. "Jake Morrison is a domestic terrorist," she announced, her voice full of fury. "This man deliberately destroyed the homes of 35 families in a calculated act of violence against our entire community." Reporters swarmed our small town like vultures sensing a fresh kill. The national news cycle latched on with ferocity. Every major outlet ran the story with some wild spin. CNN dubbed me an eco-extremist. Fox News painted me as an anti-property radical hellbent on destroying the American dream. Social media turned me into a villain overnight. #LockUp Jake began trending within hours. My inbox overflowed with death threats. Strangers called me every name imaginable. Victoria's polished performance had worked. Across the country, I was branded a lunatic, a menace, a danger to innocent families who just wanted a home by the water. She was every weary talk shows, podcasts, morning news panels, delivering her lines like a seasoned actress. Her voice quivered, her mascara ran just enough to suggest tears. She described me as a mentally unstable recluse who'd spent months orchestrating a malicious attack on hard-working people just trying to live in peace. "This man is deeply disturbed," she told one sympathetic host. "He couldn't handle change or progress, so he took it out on innocent families who believed in the future. He doesn't belong in society, he belongs behind bars." The hate campaign was relentless. On social media, I was a symbol of everything wrong with opposition to development, a madman who'd gone too far. I shut myself away in the lake house, ignoring all requests for interviews or comment. But Connor didn't retreat. While Victoria soaked up media sympathy, he was busy building a counterattack. Connor's livestream hadn't gained the same traction, but he wasn't interested in views. He was gathering hard evidence. Using his marketing background and environmental contacts, he assembled a mountain of proof that would turn the tide. 3 days after the flood, Connor released high-definition drone footage comparing historical maps with current satellite imagery. The results were damning. Morrison Lake had once been significantly larger, its natural boundaries well beyond where Victoria's houses now stood. With undeniable clarity, the footage showed the villas had been built on land that had historically been underwater for decades. They weren't lakefront homes. They were sitting directly in a natural floodplain, a land that should never have been approved for development. Dr. Jessica Wilson, a respected environmental scientist, provided an expert analysis, confirming what Connor's footage had already made clear. Victoria's entire project had violated basic environmental guidelines. No responsible review board would have greenlit it. Then came the knockout punch. Connor released a viral split-screen video that changed everything. On the left, Victoria stood in knee-deep floodwaters at a press event, solemnly declaring, "We followed every environmental regulation and secured all permits required by law." On the right, footage from a planning meeting Connor had uncovered, where Victoria chuckled dismissively, "Environmental regs, come on, we're not building a nuclear reactor. These are vacation homes for rich folks who don't give a damn about wetlands." The contrast was so blatant, so damning, that it ricocheted across the internet in hours. Millions watched in disbelief. The public, once furious at me, turned on Victoria with equal intensity. Social media armies dug deeper. They unearthed archival photos proving Morrison Lake had lost nearly 40% of its surface area due to illegal backfilling projects dating back to the 1960s. Victoria's empire was built on stolen wetlands. That discovery lit the fuse on the national movement. The #LakeJustice exploded. What started as a PR disaster for me transformed into a full-blown environmental awakening. Suddenly, I wasn't a terrorist, I was a defender of sacred land. Support poured in from across the world. Celebrities, activists, and climate influencers rallied behind the cause. "Nature is reclaiming stolen land" became the battle cry. Memes flooded the internet. Victoria standing knee-deep in the water beside the half-submerged Paradise Estates sign became iconic. My personal favorite, a split image titled Lake 1A0. When Leonardo DiCaprio tweeted his support for families resisting corporate land theft, the movement hit critical mass. Environmental groups began organizing rallies, protests, and counter-press events. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse demanding investigations into Victoria's permits and the politicians who greenlit the illegal development. Suddenly, the tide had turned, and I wasn't alone anymore. Thousands of people across the country were now defending my actions as a bold stand against ecological destruction. Public opinion shifted so dramatically that major news outlets were forced to rewrite their coverage. Some anchors even offered on-air apologies for their earlier condemnation, admitting they'd rushed to judgment without understanding the full story. But even as the narrative changed, the legal storm didn't ease. The FBI opened a federal investigation into what they were calling a possible act of eco-terrorism. 2 agents sat across from me for 6 grueling hours, grilling me about premeditated property destruction in service of environmental extremism. Meanwhile, Victoria's powerhouse legal team filed a $50 million civil suit, accusing me of sabotaging her development out of personal revenge, not principle. On top of that, 35 families displaced and furious banded together to launch a massive class action lawsuit. They demanded compensation for their flooded homes and shattered futures. Though, as the facts emerged, some began questioning whether Victoria had ever been honest about the safety of the investment she sold them. Connor kept warning me, "Dude, this isn't a joke. If they push for terrorism charges and prove intent, you could be looking at 20, maybe 25 years. I stared at the live news feed showing aerial shots of Morrison Lake, now back within its natural boundaries. "Then I need to make sure the whole truth comes out first," I said quietly. To my surprise, The public didn't just sympathize, and they mobilized. Anonymous donors set up a legal defense fund. It raised over $2 million in just 36 hours. People from every walk of life via veterans, teachers, environmentalists, and even retired engineers chipped in, showing that millions of Americans supported what I had done, even if they couldn't say so publicly. A group of environmental attorneys offered to take my case pro bono. They called it the most significant environmental justice trial of the decade and vowed to fight what they saw as a dangerous precedent of criminalizing landowners for protecting their ecological heritage. But then something unexpected happened. Connor got a message. No name, no sender, just a single, cryptic statement. I can't let an innocent man go to prison for what she did. Meet me tomorrow night. I'll give you what you need to expose the truth about Victoria Sterling. It was unsigned. No attachments. Could have been a trap. But after weeks of being villainized, after losing nearly everything, any chance to clear my Namia, even if it meant risk, was worth it. Connor arranged the meeting in a remote parking garage on the edge of town. We had no idea who would show up. It could be a whistleblower. It could be someone trying to bury us. We spent the day preparing for both. That afternoon, as we reviewed the federal summons that had just been served, Connor burst through my door, breathless and lit up with adrenaline. "Jake, you need to read this." He thrust his phone toward me. "Someone inside Victoria's camp just sent this. They say she knew, she planned this, and they've got proof." Who was this insider? A disgruntled employee? A former partner? A city official? We didn't know, but we were about to find out. The following morning, the federal courthouse looked more like a Hollywood red carpet than a legal venue. Satellite trucks lined the block. Protesters chanted on both sides of the barricade as a # justice banners on one side, while the other side held professionally printed signs demanding justice for the flooded families. It was a full-scale media circus. Security was so intense, I had to be escorted inside by a federal marshal. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal analysts, activists, and dozens of families whose lives had been swept away in the flood, still unsure whether I was a hero or a criminal. Victoria's legal team was led by Marcus Webb, a former federal prosecutor turned celebrity defense attorney. Known for his ruthless style and flair for media spin, Webb opened the case with theatrical conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen, this was not a natural disaster," he declared. "This was a calculated act of destruction. Jake Morrison deliberately flooded 35 family homes in a selfish, vengeful assault on progress. That makes this domestic terrorism plain and simple." The prosecution came armed with emotion and evidence. They laid out a damning timeline, expert testimony, and witness accounts that painted me as a ticking time bomb who had finally gone off. They described the damage as millions of dollars lost, entire neighborhoods wiped out, environmental chaos. The families took the stand. Their stories were heart-wrenching. Children who cried when their bedrooms disappeared beneath the water, retirees who had sunk every dollar into their dream homes, young couples who had envisioned raising families in a paradise that was now submerged. Victoria sat confidently in the front row, draped in a sharply cut navy suit. She played the part of the wounded visionary with eerie precision, dabbing her eyes at just the right moments, maintaining that poised expression of dignified heartbreak. But something in her eyes told a different story. Not grief, not remorse, control, the calm of someone who still believed she could rewrite reality. Little did she know her narrative was already unraveling. Victoria had always carried herself like someone certain of her righteousness and untouchable, above consequence. My overwhelmed public defender, buried under mountains of evidence and media pressure, looked completely outmatched against the legal juggernaut she had assembled. The consensus of both in the courtroom and across the airwave was grim. I was headed for federal prison, a scapegoat, a symbol. But then, everything changed. Connor's mystery contact finally revealed himself. Danny Torres, Victoria's former head of construction, fired 6 months earlier for refusing to greenlight blueprints he deemed not only unsafe but illegal. Quiet and visibly shaken, Danny had come to that parking garage carrying something that would flip the case upside down. 47 audio recordings of internal home meetings and planning sessions. Insurance, protection, just in case. He never imagined he'd need them to save someone else. "I couldn't let Jake go down for her crimes," he told Connor, his voice trembling as he handed over the USB drive. Victoria planned this whole thing from day one. It was an insurance scammer and Jake was just the perfect fall guy. That small flash drive would become the most explosive piece of evidence in state real estate history. When my defense attorney stood and announced we were ready to present our case, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Everyone could sense something was coming, something big. "Your Honor," my lawyer said, holding the USB drive aloft. His voice steadied despite the weight of what he was about to release. "We have irrefutable evidence that Ms. Sterling orchestrated an elaborate insurance fraud scheme, knowingly placing families at risk and framing my client to cover her tracks." Then he played the first clip. Victoria's voice filled the courtroom, clear and unmistakable. "Laughing. Cold. Build them right on the shoreline. If they flood, who cares? That's what flood insurance is for. We cash out twice on the sale, then again on the claim." Gasps echoed across the room. Even the jury stared in open disbelief. The spell Victoria had cast over the media, the public, and the legal system began to crack fast. And that was just the beginning. One recording after another revealed the full extent of her plan. She'd intentionally selected the most flood-prone parcels of land to cut construction costs and maximize waterfront appeal. She openly mocked regulatory concerns. And she targeted my family specifically, going so far as to say, "We'll sue that Morrison guy into the dirt if he so much as complains." The final blow came from Danny himself, taking the stand with the quiet resolve of a man who'd been silenced for too long. "She fired me for refusing to sign off on illegal site plans," he said, locking eyes with Victoria. "When I brought up historical flood data, she laughed. Told me, we're not building a nuclear facility, just overpriced vacation homes for rich people who don't give a damn about wetlands." Even the prosecution couldn't recover. The final piece of evidence shattered Victoria's entire defense. Documentation showing that she had personally secured maximum flood coverage for all 35 homes just weeks before construction began. Her insurance agent testified that she'd specifically asked for comprehensive natural disaster coverage, especially flood. It was too perfect, too calculated, too damning. Victoria never intended to build a sustainable community. She planned to cash in on disaster at the expense of my family, her investors, and the very land she claimed to celebrate. The jury took only 23 minutes. When they returned, their verdict wasn't just swift, it was seismic. Judge Harrison's face was carved from granite as he addressed Victoria, now pale and visibly shaken for the first time. "Ms. Sterling," he said, his voice thick with disgust, "this court finds you guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, reckless endangerment, and willful deception of the public. You manipulated lives, violated trust, and corrupted every principle this legal system was built to uphold." As the bailiff stepped forward with handcuffs, Victoria's mask shattered. The woman who had appeared invincibly calm, calculating, perfectly tailored, broke. Her hands trembled, her breath caught, her control gone. 40 years of revenge, gone in an instant. And the truth finally was free. Victoria's composure finally shattered as the bailiff secured the handcuffs around her wrists. After months of playing the victim, the mask cracked completely. She turned to me with venom in her eyes, her voice shaking with rage. "You think this is over? I'll make you pay for the rest of your life. My family has connections you can't even imagine." But her threats fell flat, empty echoes in a courtroom that had already rendered its judgment. She was escorted out, no longer the architect of a grand empire, just a criminal beginning an 8-year federal sentence for fraud, reckless endangerment, and conspiracy. Additional state charges were still pending, including environmental violations and fiduciary abuse. Judge Harrison had the final word. "Ms. Sterling," he said, staring her down with solemn gravity, "this court finds you guilty. You exploited trust, endangered lives, and weaponized the legal system to destroy what you could not own. This sentence will ensure you never do it again." Her empire was officially dismantled. The court ordered the demolition of all remaining villas and mandated the full restoration of Morrison Lake to its original, natural boundaries and undoing decades of illegal development. Not only was I exonerated, but I was officially appointed environmental guardian of Morrison Lake by the state's Department of Environmental Protection, granting me legal authority to protect the lake from future exploitation. And for the first time in months, peace began to return. Many of the 35 families deceived by Victoria reached out personally, grateful, not angry. They thanked me for exposing the truth before their life savings were lost to homes that would have inevitably collapsed with the next serious storm. Danny Torres, once scapegoated and silenced, was hailed as a hero and offered a new role as regional oversight manager, charged with preventing future development fraud in the state. The restoration process was a slow, deliberate act of healing. I spent weeks on site, overseeing demolition crews as they pulled out concrete, steel, and the last stubborn remains of Victoria's greed carefully, respectfully, so the lake could begin again. And it did. Crystal clear waters returned, fish populations soared, migratory birds nested in places untouched for decades. Morrison Lake was reborn. The state granted it permanent conservation status, protecting it from all future commercial development. My grandfather's legacy was finally secure. I rebuilt his memorial garden using stones salvaged from the original foundation, turning it into a quiet sanctuary where visitors could learn how one family's resistance sparked a national conversation. A bronze plaque told the story, how a dam, a key, and a legacy protected a lake from corporate theft. Connor's documentary, Lake Justice, The Victoria Sterling Fraud, exploded globally. 75 million views and multiple environmental film awards later, the world knew our story. Book deals and speaking invites poured in, but I only accepted opportunities that funded conservation projects or helped families fighting similar battles. That's why I founded the Morrison Family Environmental Defense Fund, which has already supported 6 families across 3 states. Legal experts now cite the Morrison case as a cornerstone of modern environmental law, and investigations into other whole-land development scams are underway nationwide. 1 year later, I was sitting on the dock at sunset, the lake glimmering like it had when I was a kid. Grandpa's favorite fishing spots were thriving again. Connor joined me for our annual Lake Justice Day celebration. Any regrets? He asked, camera beside him, voice low. I watched the light trickle across the surface, 20 feet deep and crystal clear. Only that I waited so long to fight back, because if we hadn't, Victoria would have won. Now, the memorial garden drew visitors from around the world, activists, students, families, all looking for hope in the face of rising corporate overreach. And then my phone buzzed, a new message. The next chapter, Mr. Morrison, Clearwater Valley Ho just built 50 luxury homes on our great-grandfather's lakefront property without consent, using the exact legal tricks Victoria used on your family. We have an old dam too, built in 1952. We never understood its purpose in a broken barn till we heard your story. Can you help our lake defend itself, too? I turned the screen toward Connor. We both knew what this meant. 50 houses this time, I said, calculating the scale. Lake Colorado's 10 times bigger than Morrison. He was already packing his gear. Road trip. He grinned, with that familiar spark in his eyes. I grabbed my keys and stared out at the lake, thinking of Grandpa, of families like ours, and of the countless stories waiting to be told across the country. Stories of inheritance, resistance, and legacy. Lake Justice Tour, nationwide, I said. Let's go teach some lakes how to fight back. As we drove toward Colorado, my phone buzzed again, then again. Texas, Michigan, Florida, families with old lakes, old dams, and new enemies, and all of them asking the same thing. Can you help our lake remember what it was built to protect? Lake Justice is now a national movement. Which state should Jake visit next? Drop your story essay and your state tab below. And if you're still reading a broken bar, you're one of us now.